Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to go ahead and get started today. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Sinclair Thomson. I teach Latin American history at New York University, and I am really delighted to be here with all of you for this event, a book presentation for Joshua Frens-String's uh, Hungry for Revolution, which we'll be talking about today, along with Karin Rosemblatt. And nice to see some familiar faces in the audience. So this is a special occasion for a couple of different reasons that each have their own backstory. And one of them is that Josh, the author of our book today, is a graduate of the New York University Latin American and Caribbean History program. And we remember our time with Josh here very fondly. He was an active, dynamic member of the community of the history department and of the Latin American Caribbean program. In what were some exciting times. Josh was involved in some of the graduate student union organizing. He was an editor of the Radical History Review, which is run out of our department. And he was working on the project that has now turned into the book. So it was exciting to see his project come to fruition, first as a dissertation, and now very exciting to see it emerge for all the public with this publication by University of California Press. Josh is currently an assistant professor of Latin American history at the University of Texas, Austin. And I should also mention one other important thing that Josh was involved in when he was here at NYU. He graduated after defending his dissertation in 2015. He then had a postdoctoral fellowship at NYU, and he was the editor of the NACLA Report on the Americas, which at the time and until recently was being the general editor was Alejandro Velasco. But Josh was involved in this, as were Christy and other friends, at a very important time for NACLA, when NACLA was really just trying to stay afloat and find the right way to make it in the world and continue to do its thing, which has been so important for us for decades now. Unfortunately, NACLA is back on its feet, but Josh had an important role to play during that transition. So Josh is now joining us from Austin, Texas, where he's currently teaching. And as I mentioned, his book, Hungry for Revolution, The Politics of Food and the Making of Modern Chile, is just out this year from University of California Press. The other backstory here is that we had originally intended to do this presentation back in the spring of 2020, and things intervened. And so actually one of the first events that we had to cancel here at NYU was the book presentation for Josh. At the time, he was on a postdoctoral fellowship up at Columbia, just uptown. We would have had him in person, which would have been great, but circumstances didn't quite permit it. So it's a year and a half later. Josh is not able to join us in person now either, but we thought we would go ahead with it because the book is out. And after all, Zoom has given us a few opportunities, and one of them is to bring together people who are not in the physical space. So for that, we are grateful because it allows Karin Rosemblatt to be with us. Karin teaches Latin American history at the University of Maryland, and I believe she also runs the Institute of Historical Studies. Is that what it is? Center for Historical Studies at University of Maryland. Karin is the author of a very important book on gender ideology in early to mid 20th century Chile. Her book is called Gendered Compromises, Political Cultures and the State in Chile, 1920 to 1950. I highly recommend it. It won prizes for its innovative analysis. She's also the co-editor for a cutting-edge edited volume called Race and Nation in Modern Latin America. And most recently, she published The Science and Politics of Race in Mexico and the United States, 1910 to 1950. She's the author of a number of other great articles, which have also received acclaim. And so she's joining us to discuss the book today. And we're very grateful to Karin for being with us. So the way this will work is Josh will start us off with some general comments, and then Karin will make a few comments of her own and open up some questions for conversation with Josh. And at the end of the period, we'll open it up for question and answers from everybody who's present today. So I think that's all I have to say, and can pass the mic over to Josh. And again, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much, Sinclair, for that introduction. Let me just pull up my PowerPoint here. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Okay. So yes, thank you again. It's so wonderful to be here, even though it's virtually, as Sinclair said. It's been a much delayed presentation, and in some ways it's even nicer now to be here than a year and a half ago with the book finally out in the world, published, came out in June of this year. So it's exciting to share this with former colleagues and friends and supervisors at NYU. As Sinclair said, I finished my PhD at NYU in 2015 under his guidance, as well as the guidance of Greg Grandin, Barbara Weinstein, Alejandro Velasco, among others. So it's really wonderful to be back with you all today. It's also great to have Karin's expertise and wisdom on the topic. Her work, as Sinclair mentioned, on gender in the Popular Front era, in particular in Chile, has been very influential in my thinking about this book and in thinking about 20th century Chilean history more generally. So I look forward to having her as the discussant after I present here today. So just to briefly summarize in a couple of words what this book tries to do, it's essentially a history of the rise and fall of Chile's popular unity, or Unidad Popular revolution in the early 1970s, that's told through this long history of food, of struggle over food, of different visions of the relationship between democracy and food, developmentalism and food, and ultimately citizenship and food. I try to show the ways that food both helps us to understand where the Unidad Popular revolution came from in Chilean history. It also seeks to show the different ways that the political left in Chile and its base of support came to envision socialism, or the idea of socialist transformation in the 20th century. And then ultimately, the book points to what I think are some new ways to interpret where this revolution ultimately comes up short, and then what some of the longer term consequences of the revolution's demise were, leading up really into the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet and the rise of the sort of neoliberal era of the late 70s, 80s, and into the post-dictatorial period of the 1990s. Almost a decade ago, when I started doing research for this book, I became fascinated by a slogan that the Allende government, the Allende coalition, was using in the lead up to their 1970 election. And that was the slogan that Chile's revolution would have the, quote, flavor of empanadas and red wine, of empanadas and vino tinto. Beyond a few sort of passing mentions of that mantra in different political histories of the UP era, and those references tended to sort of argue that that mantra emphasized the sort of unique Chilean character of the revolution as opposed to Cuba, opposed to the Soviet Union, I was really struck by how few scholars had explored how and why two quintessentially Chilean culinary items had come to stand in for the supposedly distinct, unique, even exceptional, perhaps, goals of Allende's democratic road to socialism. As I started to think about those words, empanadas and red wine, I kind of began a long archival journey going back 5 or 6 decades even. I began working with economic records. I think some of the first archives that I did research in were archives related to Chile's National Price Control Agency, which gets its start in the 1930s. I began looking at nutrition journals, different ways to access the importance, the social and political importance of food in the 20th century, public health ministry documentation. Then turned to land reform, thinking about agricultural reform and what was actually being produced through agrarian reform, the content, the food content that came out of that redistributive process of dividing up large land holdings. I stumbled across some incredible photo archives, some of which appear in the book, photos like this of Salvador Allende at an olla común, a sort of common pot, distributing food on the margins of Santiago in the early 1970s. And I began to ask through some of these initial findings how a history of the popular unity experience that was centered around food would alter our understanding of that 1,000-day revolution, as well as the broader history of Chilean popular politics and state formation in the 20th century. The writing that eventually resulted from that research became an attempt to reconstruct how decades of struggle over food helped create or fueled the sort of architecture of Chile's social welfare state. And ultimately, I saw the importance of this work sort of residing in the linking together of a history of agrarian modernization and eventually agrarian reform, and this long persistent march or struggle of urban mobilization of workers around a basic social and economic right to cheap, abundant, and nutritious foodstuffs. And I began to see these two things as ultimately being related, right? This traditional urban history and this agricultural or rural history were deeply connected in the 20th century. By placing food at the center, I came to see the different ways that Chileans across multiple decades had sought to make food security a right of citizenship and really the cornerstone of a more inclusive vision of economic democracy. And beyond this, I wanted to argue in the book that food was more than simply an interesting window into 20th century Chilean political and social history, but it was also a sort of driving force behind different moments of change, and ultimately in this revolutionary experience of the 1970s and the counter-revolution that followed. I think the final thing that the book does, although perhaps it was not my initial goal, is it helps us think about a much more extended chronology or periodization of the revolution. Typically, histories of the UP might begin somewhere in the 1960s, are set sort of within a sort of narrow Cold War context. And I wanted to show that this was, a process that was really 5 decades in the making, that had these very important domestic and also regional origins, and that connecting together the popular front era of the 30s and 40s with the popular unity era of the early 1970s was a really sort of rich and productive way of rethinking the importance of the Unidad Popular coalition and its election. There are sort of 3 basic questions that I seek to answer, and that I'll present a bit of in my presentation today. The first big question that guides the book and my presentation is, what role did food struggles play in organizing the political left and the sort of broader workers' movement or labor movement in modern Chile, and particularly in the mid-20th century? And my answer to that is quite simple and straightforward. I would argue food played an absolutely essential and significant role in the Chilean left, although it's been little studied or little explored in the traditional historiography of the left and of the labor movement. It was around struggles over food, what were often called bienes de primera necesidad, sort of staple goods, articles of primary necessity, that many of the first instances of cross-class collaboration, of coalition building took form. And this goes all the way back to the immediate post-World War I period, continues after the Great Depression during the formation of the Popular Front. The role of food, as well as other goods, struggle for housing has been written about in the Chilean context. These were really key sites of mobilization beyond the traditional workplace that brought together women, brought together workers, brought together sort of a generation of middle-class reformers, among others. The second big question that I ask and seek to answer is what the relationship was between the sort of emergent social welfare or developmental state and those early instances of food or consumer mobilization. And I argue in response to that question that the Chilean state tended to adopt these nutrition or food-oriented policies in response to popular mobilization. And that it's, I think, productive to think about the formation of the social welfare state as a sort of reactive response to contain political protests in the mid-20th century. Many of those food policies were successful in raising living standards, particularly in urban areas. They were essential to constructing a sort of common notion of economic decency or dignity. In certain cases, they even challenged global economic inequalities that were perhaps based on an unequal trade relationship with the global north. However, ultimately, those policies really struggled to resolve the deeply entrenched inequalities that existed in Chile over this period. Inequalities between rural and urban spaces, gender-based inequalities, as well as class-based inequalities. There was a focus on controlling food prices and promoting nutrition, but ultimately those did not result in the sort of political dismantling of the power of large landholders, of those who got rich on the distribution of food and other aspects of the sort of basic food economy. The third issue I explore is the way in which the sort of left labor mobilization in the late 60s and early 1970s represented continuity with that earlier period, with the 30s and 40s in particular. And related to that, the question of whether the government, the Unidad Popular Coalition's approach to food represented a form of continuity with what was happening in the 30s and 40s. There are many continuities, and I'll talk about a few of them today, but I think what really defines the popular unity period is it's this moment in which the sort of contradiction between a sort of urban focused economic program and a rural history of rural exclusion come to the forefront. And I would argue that one of the key objectives of the revolution is to resolve that contradiction, to both meet the demands of urban consumers and rural producers, particularly small rural producers, at the same time. It's at the center of the Unidad Popular's approach to agrarian reform. It gives, I think, the Chilean revolution and Chilean socialism broad popular appeal across various geographic spaces. But it's ultimately the area where I think the revolution comes up short, and it's the place that the counter-revolution really gets its own base of support. And that counter-revolution at least in the final months of the Unidad Popular period, really takes hold both in the marketplace and in the agrarian countryside. I want to go through just a few examples that highlight some of these broad arguments in my remarks today. One of the first things that I quickly realized when I started research for the dissertation, which eventually, as Sinclair said, became the book, was that for almost the entirety of the mid-20th century, food consumption, and particularly the struggle over the consumption of basic food staples, was at the center of how everyday, ordinary citizens, particularly those who were attracted to the political left, came to understand the concept of citizenship and the ultimate purpose of national economic development. The flip side of that was that disruptions to this sort of perceived right to basic subsistence led often to some of the most important social and political mobilizations of a broad cross-section of Chilean society. One of those first moments you can see in the images here was in 1918, when a very fascinating movement, which actually goes by the name of the translation would be the National Workers' Assembly for Nutrition, the AOAN in Spanish acronym, takes to the streets of major cities around Chile, particularly Santiago, and demands this really remarkable platform of national economic reforms in order to bring down the rising cost of food and make Chile less dependent on foreign food imports to feed its growing urban population. Many of those who took part in those marches were economic migrants who had been displaced from mining centers in the north of Chile after the war. This is a process that continues through the 1920s until the Great Depression. One of the leaders of that movement was a guy named Carlos Alberto Martinez, who becomes very prominent in the mid-century Chilean left. He's eventually an agriculture minister. He's a longtime socialist senator. He begins as a member of what becomes the Chilean Communist Party, and eventually then goes to the Chilean Socialist Party in the late 1920s. And this view of consumption as a basic right really flies in the face of sort of the traditional historical interpretation of consumer politics. For any of those of you who've studied Latin America or studied what happens in Chile in the 70s and 80s, there's this tendency to equate consumption or consumerism with the rise of a neoliberal state, equating sort of participation in the consumer marketplace with politics. And politics, the marketplace really comes to replace or become a substitute for the mass politics of the shop floor, of unions. It becomes a sort of permissible form of citizen participation. What's going on in the 1910s and 1920s is something very different. These are movements that are demanding that a strong state needed to be built in order to tame the sort of unfettered power of the open marketplace and ultimately guarantee access to these essential consumer goods, among them a whole host of foodstuffs. The AOAN puts together this pretty incredible manifesto in 1918. It's a very detailed, actually, economic program that includes comprehensive agrarian reform. And by that, they mean both the redistribution of agricultural land to smallholders, as well as the modernization of production techniques in the countryside. They call for a new tax and trade policy, ending taxes on essential food imports that need to come into Chile, particularly beef, and restrictions on the sale of Chilean domestically produced goods such as wheat. They're the first movement to call for a national price control system to help urban consumers obtain essential goods in the face of inflation. And they also call for a greater, more sophisticated form of direct food distribution, a sort of new supply chain in which producers would directly be selling to urban consumers and cutting out the price gouging middleman who was the sort of enemy, constructed as the political enemy of the urban worker. Many of these policies are implemented in different moments over the late 20s and early 30s. They become a rallying cry for the Chilean Communist Party as the Popular Front takes form in the mid-1930s. And as I argue in the book, they're at the center of what mid-century mass politics comes to demand of the state. In the middle sections of the book, I move from the street into the halls of government, and I look at the way in which that developmental state forms in relationship to those earlier protest movements. And one of the focuses, this is chapter 3 of the book, is on the state's creation of new public health institutions, particularly institutions and agencies that deal with popular nutrition. In the mid-1930s, an office called the National Nutrition Council is formed under the broader umbrella of the Ministry of Health. There's a great deal of both nutritional research and social science research that happens in this agency, mapping and collecting information about workers' consumption habits, drawing on new ideas of nutrition science to promote the consumption of things called protective foods, foods that would reduce incidences of social diseases like tuberculosis, and also help raise lower infant mortality rates, raise childhood life expectancy, and deal with this problem that people like Salvador Allende himself would write a great deal about in the 1930s. This was, as I show, and this draws heavily on Karin Rosemblatt's own work, this was a deeply gendered process in which women were often identified as the sort of problem, right? They were the provisioners of food, and it was their lack of sort of consumer knowledge, of nutritional knowledge, that often caused children to not have adequate access to milk, adequate access to other essential goods that had vitamins, minerals, and other nutrients. Much of this was also directed towards constructing a vision of the consumer as a male worker, right? Protecting his productive capacity by making sure that he had adequate access to protein and other sort of restorative nutrients, so he wasn't getting sick at the workplace and could keep the economy going. I focus a lot on milk in this chapter, and certainly Chile is not unique in this sense, but Chile's social welfare state really focuses on the development of broad-based access to milk for children. They create these things that you see in the top left here called milk bars around some of Chile's most largest urban centers, places where you could get not just milk, but things like ice cream, other dairy products, with the understanding that the sort of low consumption back Chile's national development in the mid-20th century. Agrarian reform and modernization is also, I argue, a key element of this project of containment. And my chapter on agrarian reform takes at its center the content of the agrarian reform process, less about redistribution of land and more on what the state is promoting in terms of production on those lands. There's a research institute that's created that begins experimenting with new varieties of wheat, of new varieties of potatoes, of other vegetables, of fruits, trying to make their yields larger, and ultimately directing much of that consumption to urban consumers across across Chile in the 1960s, in particular, agrarian reform beginning under the Christian Democrats, the predecessor to Salvador Allende, 1964 to 1970. The events of the 1920s through the 1960s, these 3 or 4 decades before the revolution begins, in many ways pave the way for Allende's election. It's one of my big arguments of the book. They also pave the way, I would argue, for the counter-revolution that rises up against Allende's government. And my writing and thinking about the popular unity years tries to emphasize that this idea of food justice, or you might say food democracy, was a key but a yet underexplored element of Allende's revolutionary dreams and the revolutionary dreams of his supporters. It's 51 years ago this week that Allende assumed office in Chile. His coalition bringing together socialists, communists, progressive Catholics, a handful of other smaller middle-class reform movements. One of the first things that Allende does is accelerate the agrarian reform process, redistributing tens of thousands of acres of land within the first 8 to 12 months that his government is in power. In some cases, he simply extends what was happening under the Frey government. There's this focus on producing new sources of protein, chickens, pork, as well as development of Chile's Pacific coastline, encouraging production of fish and ultimately the consumption of domestically harvested fish from the Pacific. The government goes beyond that in also rethinking the entire food system. One of the novelties of the popular unity period are the creation of these neighborhood price and supply committees called the JAPs, the Juntas de Abastecimiento y Precios. These are often depicted as a sort of stopgap measure, an emergency measure during the revolution, addressing issues of shortages and scarcity. But I think when you think about parallels between the JAP and things that happened in the 30s and 40s, you see this broader understanding of economic democracy. The far left in Chile, the radical left, tended to emphasize this notion of popular power, grassroots-led democracy, and the JAP become a key site of that popular power in distributing food to neighborhoods, particularly in a moment in which the opposition is waging a very often violent and disruptive economic war on the popular unity government. It becomes a way, I argue, to re-envision the entire supply chain, often connecting agrarian reform settlements to low-wage workers, shantytown dwellers who had really historically had very limited access to some of the most quintessentially Chilean goods, right? Things like beef, chicken, fresh vegetables, and other nutritious foods. In short, I would say that the history of agrarian reform and the struggle for socialist equality is very much a history of food in Chile. And perhaps this is something we can talk about that may apply even beyond Chile, thinking about what's happening in mid-century socialist or reform-minded movements. Now, the quest for a society in which empanadas and red wine were abundant and accessible to all, of course, does not end in triumph. The year 1971, the first year of the revolution, was one of the most unprecedented moments of consumer bounty in 20th century Chilean history. But the last year or two were ones that were filled with intense social and economic struggle. And the return of food-based insecurity would become an issue that the Chilean opposition to Allende would really rally around. I argue that the government, by continuing to advocate a vision of proper food consumption that was overly rooted in calculations of calories and vitamins. They tended to minimize the social and cultural meaning that certain foods had to Chilean consumers. Chilean consumers protested the idea that they were being forced to eat thawed merluza, thawed hake, which dissolved and turned into this mush. And that was presented as a sort of sufficient substitute for scarce beef. It did not ultimately please many middle-class consumers in particular. In presenting women as both the cause of decades of poor nutrition and the solution to those problems, the government tended to reproduce a highly gendered notion of femininity that ultimately impeded women's political action outside of the household. And by too often emphasizing technical solutions to food production problems, I argue that agrarian experts did little to tackle the deep-seated political power that Chile's large landowner class, as well as its merchants and food distributors, continued to exercise throughout the revolution. As a counter-revolution against the UP took hold, few images would be more iconic than images such as these on your screen of women going out to the street banging empty pots and pans. There were also very iconic images of private food distributors turning off the engines of their distribution trucks, most famously in October of 1972, preventing the delivery of foodstuffs to consumer markets, as well as things like seeds for the spring planting season, which would have disastrous effects in 1973 as farmers were unable to get their crops in on time and disrupting the fall harvest of 1973. Taken together, such actions helped to transform food into what I see as a sort of market-based commodity, as opposed to a basic social and economic right. And this I see as a sort of key way of explaining some of the domestic and sort of social origins of the neoliberal state that emerges after Allende is overthrown. If you want to jump ahead to the present day, I do think there are some ramifications or some interesting sort of repercussions of this history today. Chileans, as we were talking about before this session began, are currently in the process of rewriting their own constitution. And at the very center of that project is a reassertion of social and economic citizenship in Chile. And in the lead up to presidential elections in a couple of weeks, we really see that version of citizenship on the left coming into form, but running up against the sort of reassertion of the market-based citizenship that the Chilean conservative right has articulated over the last 3 or 4 decades. I'll leave my comments there. I look forward to hearing Karin Rosemblatt's comments into the discussion that follows.
Okay, Josh, thanks very much. It's a really helpful overview of the book and a really clear panorama of the questions and arguments. So we'll now go to Karin for some of her thoughts, questions, and allow the two of you to think through some of the questions together.
Great. Well, thank you to Sinclair and Clax and to Joshua for inviting me to comment on this book. I jumped at the opportunity in part because I'm sort of thinking about moving into some area of food history myself. And I have to say, I really enjoyed reading this book. It's a good read. It's well written, and really, I felt it was a lot of fun. As the blurb on the back of the back cover says, and I think Joshua reiterated, this is really a panoramic view of 20th century history that's narrated through the lens of food. And part of what makes the book fun is Joshua's wordplay, which comes out very clearly in some of his chapter headings and in some of the subheadings. So we have things like cultivating consumption, communist consumers, politicizing protein, recipe for revolution, pantry politics, and militant merchants, all the alliterations. And then we have other forms of wordplay as well, in which Joshua really applies to the Chilean reality expressions that originated in other times, places, and in relation to other events. So we have the Green Revolution in Liberty, alluding to Eduardo's phrase, 1960 revolution in Liberty. Then there's an allusion to the Bible and the Popular Unity's efforts to substitute fish for scarce beef. Multiplication of the fish is a subtitle. The battle for the Chilean stomach. Just markets. October counter-revolutionaries, alluding to the right-wing strike, and supermarket economy. So these interjected a lot of fun into the book, but as I thought about this wordplay, I realized just how extensive the metaphors of agriculture and the metaphors around food are in our everyday language. And I think that really points to the centrality of the topic of this book, food, for our understanding of a panoply of social phenomenon. And of course, the title of this book, Hungry for Revolution, really points to that aspect and the centrality of food as metaphor, but also as the object of struggle. So one of the questions I wanted to pose to you, which I think you sort of answered a little bit in your own presentation, which was how you came to write a book which focused primarily on the formal politics and policy making around food, because that is not where the broader scholarship on food really is. That the broader scholarship around food has tended, I would say this would be my characterization, to focus on ecologies, on political economies, on labor dynamics of food production. That's one set of writing. And then there's another set of writings which tend to focus more on the cultural significance of food, whether that significance is related to questions around affect, gender, ethnicity, tacos, or whether they're related to questions around health and illness. And your book doesn't really take either of these two tacks. If I had to characterize the book in one sentence, I would say that it instead is about the formal politics around issues of consumption in general and food consumption in particular. And that's also a departure for Chilean history, which has really tended to focus a lot more on questions of land and labor. But of course, the exception to this would be perhaps Heidi Tinsman's book, which deals so centrally with consumption, and I think was a big influence probably also as well, Joshua, in your work. So the questions around politics of consumption are really at the center here. And one of the surprising elements of the book, and to me one of the most interesting, was that it says a lot about a topic that we're going to be hearing a lot more about, I think, in the years to come, which is supply chains. And also, it says a lot about the politics around issues related to the supply of basic goods. So for those of you who have not read the book, I think Joshua's done a good job of outlining some of the main themes. Let me also say a bit about what the book is about and how it relates to different literatures. So the first part of the book covers the period up to 1930, and it focuses on a series of very significant mobilizations that took place around questions of food consumption and the cost of living. As the nitrate mines grew in the north, and also we have the rise of urban populations, what we see in Chile is the growth of a lot of people who basically are no longer able to grow their own food. And so at the same time, the Chilean agricultural production was also not able to readily supply foodstuffs to these Chilean populations in mining centers and urban areas. So this leads obviously to high cost of foodstuff and scarcity. And it's really this that fuels a lot of this protest around food. So again, here we see the issue kind of social conflict and its relation to questions around supply chains. And then, so the response to this then is for the state to, or for demands that the state take measures to regulate supply chains, to regulate the supply of certain very basic foodstuffs. The second section of the book focuses on expertise regarding nutrition and regarding agriculture. The literature on agricultural modernization in Chile and in Latin America is a pretty robust and extensive literature. But surprisingly, and I don't think I had really realized this until I read Josh's book, surprisingly, we have yet to hear much about the Green Revolution in Chile. And this is really a surprise because Chile is such an important agricultural country. And it had such strong links to, and its agrarian reform was so strongly linked to the US university system, I would say, that it is really surprising that we haven't really heard much about the Green Revolution technologies and the modernization of Chilean agriculture. And I think here Joshua really opens up a whole new area for research that that would be very interesting for other scholars and would join literature, for example, Tori Olson's book on Mexico. And it also joins really some new work that has become much more interested in the history of technology, right? And the relation of technology and national resource extraction. And I think one of the things that's happened in the historiography on Chile is that because Chilean agriculture has been kind of characterized as backwards in Chilean large agricultural enterprises and their owners have been characterized as backwards, we have not really seen that in fact there was a very important modernization of agriculture that was going on, that the state was very involved in that. There were a lot of transnational actors that were involved in the modernization of agriculture. So this to me was a very interesting aspect of the book. The other aspect of expertise that Joshua looks at has to do with nutritional expertise. And here we really don't have as much work on this topic, or we don't have as long a history, but I do point to the fact that there is really interesting work being done on this question of expertise in nutrition for Chile by Juan Carlos Yáñez and Soledad Zárate, for Mexico by Joel Vargas, and for Stefan Paul Valero, who has been working on this topic in Colombia. So I think, Joshua, you really add the Chilean case and the specificity of the Chilean case to this other emerging work that's being done on nutritional expertise. And I wonder, one of the questions that I would have for you as we, after that you might want to respond to is, in your presentation today, you really talked about expertise as sort of limiting and controlling popular movements around consumption. But in my own reading of what you write in this part of the book, it seemed to me that you are also making the case that expertise allowed or provided an avenue for the Chilean state to kind of intervene, or a way for the Chilean state to intervene in these issues and satisfy popular demands, while also claiming that they were doing what was scientifically valid or validated. So it's a question for you. The third section of the book is the story about the popular unity and the struggles around consumption. At the center of this section are the JAP, the Juntas de Abastecimiento y Precios, which were the popular unities, neighborhood food distribution groups. So you began to answer this, but perhaps you have more to say about the topic. I'm intrigued about how your approach to state intervention and the politics of food developed. It seemed to me, and I think you've said this in your own presentation, that this started off as an effort to explain the struggles around consumption during the popular unity period. That for me means that the work is, and you really talked about this here in your presentation, but it's not so much in the book, that you are part of a broader trend within Chilean historiography that's showing that state intervention on the side of both producers and consumers, including large-scale consumers and the capitalist class, and that the conflicts between, or the state's involvement in the conflicts between producers and consumers has a very long history. In other words, it's not just something that exploded during the popular unity period, but that there's a long 20th century trajectory. So Josh is part of a historiography that's chipping away at chronological markers that have divided the popular unity from the reformist governments that came before, and also breaking down the chronological barriers between the Pinochet dictatorship's pro-business policies and the state policies that came before and that came after in the Concertación governments. And one of the things I also really enjoyed about this book is how you foreground the very reactionary nature of the Chilean right wing and their opposition to state policies and to democratization, reaching back to the first decades, but also the way, the anti-communist wave that struck Chile in the aftermath of World War II. So, one of the questions I had specifically regarding the third part of the book and regarding the HAP and these neighborhood provisioning committees is, this long scale perspective. From this long scale perspective, these neighborhood groups start to look a lot less like Cuban style vehicles for state informants, which some have claimed them to be, and a lot more like the consumer groups that were part of Chileans' women's movements beginning in the 1930s and all the way up through the 1970s. And maybe it also helps us to rethink neighborhood groups like the CDRs in Cuba and even in post-revolutionary Nicaragua. They start to look a little bit different as well if we take this kind of longer historical perspective on popular mobilization. So I'll just leave it there, and maybe, I do have more questions, but maybe we could start off with the question around the politics of expertise and how you see the questions around expertise either in agriculture or in nutrition science, and the role that expertise and the experts played during this long history.
Thank you so much for those wonderful comments, Karin, and for your close reading of the book. Yeah, fantastic. I wanted to, so I'll definitely answer the question on expertise. I wanted to address the very first question as well of, how this book looks different than some of the typical trends in food studies, the literature, of the last decade or two, because that is something I was trying to do distinctly, right? Especially the sort of more cultural studies of food that relies, in different anthropological theory on the symbolic value of food. That's not so prominent, although I think in the final chapters, I do emphasize or try to get across the point that the Popular Unity Coalition's inability to think about food as something that has cultural value to people was one of its downfalls, right? People did care. They didn't just want protein. They wanted protein that tasted a particular way, right? And that was associated with, status or a class marker or, some idea of what it meant to be Chilean. And that's really important, but is not really understood by the government itself. I think what I was trying to do, though, by focusing on politics and policy and I think even the sort of economics of food was to bring implicitly this book into conversation with broader discussions, histories of capitalism in Latin America, and thinking about both the social and economic ramifications of these different policies. It was more than just a cultural struggle over different symbols and significances, but it was about, what the actual state and economy would look like and what the term development meant. So much of the discussions about development in the Chilean context were connected in one way or another to how food was produced, distributed, and ultimately consumed. So it sort of had that kind of natural direction the debates about food did. The other issue, and this has come up in some other talks I've given, is that when I started to look in the early 20th century, the AOAN, as well as the work of the Communist Party in the 1930s, the issue of consumption was everywhere. It was being politicized by groups that saw themselves very clearly as part of the political left. And what's happening in Chile in the 30s and 40s is not dissimilar to what was happening in Argentina under Perón, things that are happening in Brazil, Mexico, other parts of Latin America. What I think is slightly different than some of those places is this really was an issue of the left, people who identified as socialists and communists. There were others who then joined those movements, but it didn't have that sort of broad, more sort of politically ambiguous, populist form in Chile, at least when you look at kind of the grassroots politics. And so I kind of began with that focus and understood the ways in which it was really politicized as something that was, to be progressive was to demand price controls, was to demand these broader regulations on the food economy. On the question of expertise, this is a really interesting issue, and I think I go back and forth on it, right? Were the experts simply trying to contain the masses, contain popular groups, or was there some other more sort of progressive, forward-looking vision behind some of their ideas? If you look at some of the food experts in the area of nutrition, you see people who are politically quite conservative, right? So the guy I focus on, Eduardo Cruz Coque, a minister of health that precedes the Popular Front era, is a prominent member of the Chilean Conservative Party, which had some, I would say, social democratic impulses, but was a kind of predecessor to the Christian Democratic Party and also had some quite conservative figures. Eduardo Cruz Coque is a fascinating example of someone who by the late 1940s runs for president, loses to Gabriel González Videla, who the communists support, and then González Videla very famously turns on the communists. And many members of the Communist Party, including very prominent people, come to regret the decision to support González Videla and wish they had supported this guy who was nominally a conservative, Cruz Coque. And so there's, I think, this very unifying social democratic vision between the communists and the conservatives around the issue of nutrition and around what some of the key institutions of the early social welfare state would look like. So I think more similarities than dissimilarity. I think the motivation for each of those two groups promoting a sort of developmental state are different. This evolves over time. I think the people who promote agrarian reform are doing it for a more sort of emancipatory project than someone like Cruz Coque was when it came to nutrition. But I think it's possible for both of these things to happen at the same time, right? This goal of political containment while also understanding that the horizon of the state in the mid-20th century was intervention. Everyone was supporting an interventionist state, and that was kind of the broader common sense. The issue of the hop that you mentioned, also I'll just say one thing there. I think your interpretation is exactly correct. And what I'm trying to do is reorient this from this, institution that emerges completely out of the ether and that is inspired by Cuba, and showing that, this is something that consumer activists had been demanding for several decades. The work that the hop is doing is the exact same work that these things called the juntas de vigilancia were doing in the 30s and 40s. Although Allende's vision is, I think, a bit broader in that he's trying to actually connect producers and consumers through the hop in a way that didn't exist in the earlier period. I think I'll leave my comments there if you have more things to follow up with, I'd be glad to hear them, or other comments from others in the audience.
So a comment in passing first, there was a picture at some point in your presentation of a child with a milk bottle next to him, and suspiciously looks the bottle in the shape of Donald Duck. It may be, it may not be. So I was wondering if in the spirit of wordplay, the Spanish translation might read para beber al pato Donald. So I don't know, but maybe the chronology of, or other factors are clues that is not done, although it really does look. Anyway, but the questions I had have to do with the part where you cover the counter-revolution, especially. So you mentioned the marketplace, so the revolt of the bourgeoisie, maybe. I think that's Patricio Guzman's phrase, I think. And then aside from the marketplace is the agricultural sector. So I was wondering on the first if that is if that's the revolution is restricted to the middle class and upper middle class and so on in the marketplace, and then you mentioned the big landowners in the agricultural sector. So is that, is there counter-revolution restricted to those groups? And then the other question has to do with, transportation. So, I mean, you mentioned, of course, the truckers strike, and that how that paralyzed, or that it stops the delivery of both food and seed to the countryside. So I was wondering to what extent you engage with that, also with the trucker strike and the foreign sources of funding for that strike as well. So yeah.
Thanks, Federico, for those questions. Yet the very keen eye in noticing that bottle of milk. It's from the Chilean National Historical Museum, and I don't know if it had a specific date on it. It's not in the book. It's either from the late 1960s or early 1970s. I'm not quite sure if it's exactly from the Popular Unity Revolution or from the Frey period, but one of the two, if my memory serves me. The question about the kind of class composition of the counter-revolution is something I've thought a lot about, and I think there is a lot of newer scholarship, or newish, over the last maybe 20 years, who's thinking of Margaret Power's work, some of other work on the Marchas de las Ollas Vacías, that's tried to emphasize that it wasn't simply upper class women, or even perhaps just middle class women, who became frustrated with the long lines and the scarcity. There was some popular component to that, and I think that's true. I don't think Margaret Power's book necessarily does this, but I think there's a tendency to extend the kind of social basis across all social classes, and say that there were a lot of popular groups that were really upset with Allende too, and I think that's perhaps been a bit overstated in some of that more recent stuff. And so I'm kind of reacting a bit to that, where I really do think it was largely middle class consumers and upper middle class groups, at least among women, that were kind of on the vanguard. And over time, by 1973, it's a very different looking social and economic environment in Chile than in late 1971, when some of those first marches happened. The economy, there were very isolated instances of scarcity for certain goods, particularly beef, at the end of 1971. But by most economic accounts, the economy was still doing quite well at that point. And it's really not until 1972, and then definitely into 1973, when that crisis expands. So the women who are banging pots and pans in late 1971, I think, are largely from a particular socioeconomic background. The Chilean historian Marcelo Casals has a great article that came out a year or two ago in Journal of Social History that really looks at these same groups that I kind of put together in the last chapter of the book. The middle class kind of merchants, landowners, distributors, and they're not all certainly of the upper classes, but they fit these very interesting points on the supply chain, to go back to what Karin was talking about. And the big fear of all of them is that their businesses, they were often business owners, right, or controlling the trucking syndicate. They own their own trucks, for example. And, they're worried that their small businesses are going to be seized by the state. This is the big thing that leads to the trucker strike, is that for several months, there was this sense that Allende was going to actually nationalize the supply chain, and the trucking industry would become state-owned. Private shopkeepers were worried that their wholesale syndicate that they helped to control was going to be taken over by the state, and there was a competing state firm that was already growing in size and in sort of relationship to the privately controlled wholesale group. So, they may have had varied class backgrounds, but they were, I think I agree with Patricio Guzman's sentiment that they were sort of, the petite bourgeoisie, small business owners. I tried to emphasize, though, that this all begins with land reform. So the big protests, if you go back to the late 1960s, even before Allende comes to power, it's the revolt of the landowners against any form of agricultural redistribution that sets this in motion. And if anything, when Allende comes to power the first year, he makes a sort of alliance, or it is a sort of truce that happens with some of the large landowners. They were really pissed off when Eduardo Frei was on his way out with how agrarian reform was happening. And Allende tries to kind of patch things up for a bit, and does for the first year. But they're on kind of the vanguard. And that is also something that I think is a contribution or intervention here, thinking about the kind of traditional oligarchy in the countryside as setting the stage for the rise of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism and landowners are typically not analyzed as kind of being part of the same group, but I think they paved the way for those ideas to take hold a couple of years later.
Hi, thanks everyone. Thanks Josh for doing this, for giving this presentation. I'm so excited to see this work done and see it being presented at NYU. It's so cool. I'm coming to this presentation immediately from a meeting of another conference, and so maybe the thing that's on my mind is like completely sort of overdetermined by that. But my question is about, and I know you've given a presentation about this elsewhere and have an article maybe about the kind of socialist developmental vision that's at work here, and how the vision of development that you sort of trace in the book might help us revise what we think, the history of development is, or what that means, right? So obviously that's, sort of my abiding interest. So sorry for throwing that question in there, but I do think that there is so the conference that I was at this morning, the initial meeting is a new conference that's specifically about questions of socialism and development kind of beyond the Cold War divide. And so thinking about socialist developmentalisms that we maybe haven't reconsidered. I wonder how you think your book contributes to that, and what we need to know when it comes to the Allende case.
Yeah, that's a great question. That I will admit that my sort of analysis of the term development is not nearly as sort of rigorous as the centerpiece of my work as it is in so much of yours, Christy. But I think what Allende is trying to do, particularly in that 3-year period of the revolution, is envision some idea of a sort of alternative socialist modernity. So this happens in food, but it's not exclusive to food, right? Producing, consumer essentials that are within reach of working class people, even rural groups. So Chile very famously, right, produces its own television for the working class. The Antu creates from a nationalized Citroen factory a car for the working class. Historian Camilo Trumper has written about a whole host of other goods, from everything like a nested silverware set that could be produced very inexpensively and distributed to, I think I mentioned these new shipping crates that actually are key in distributing the fish that Chile harvests. They get the kind of molds and the set up production of these new plastic crates. So there's like, there's all these objects that I think become associated with that vision of socialist modernity. And I think that's part of the story. I think also, though, I would argue, right, that vision of socialist modernity is many decades in the making. And I think food highlights that. So equitable access to food as a basic social right is something that I think may be unique to the Chilean left, but perhaps not. It's certainly something that's going on, and it's several decades in the making, and it wasn't first articulated as a sort of alternative socialist modernity, but Allende and the socialist and communist left are picking up all of these ideas over the course of their own political formation. So I think perhaps that is a sort of argument or intervention that I would add to that conversation, is that the idea of socialist developmentalism or socialist modernity doesn't just emerge during the Cold War period, right? It's something that has origins going back to, the Chilean Communist Party exists before the Russian Revolution, right? So there's these ideas are circulating for many, many decades before, the ideas of developmentalism, the idea of socialism kind of map on to these older ideas. I have an article, I think, that you mentioned on this phrase that becomes popular among certain economists in the 1970s, that Allende's political economy would provide a popular option for development. And my sense has always been that that's sort of in dialogue with the kind of preferential option for the poor, although I've never found a direct reference that says that's where it's coming from, but they're, thinking about making consumption, mass consumption, actually mass, right? Giving it to the masses in this different social and economic context than existed, say, in the mid-century United States or mid-century Europe.
Thank you, Josh. So I guess I have a couple of questions that one follows from this point exactly. And I guess it's about the larger continental connections that you're tracing. And Karin suggested it a little bit in terms of what's happening in Nicaragua a little bit later, but also Brazil under Lula, the Fome Zero program, right? That insofar as the question around socialist goals is no longer tied exclusively to land and labor, but to land, food, and labor. And so it's less of an ancillary point, but rather a more central one. It seems to be something that is taken up in the larger socialist repertoire. But I guess my question then is, seeing therefore, how would you therefore situate the Chilean example within that larger continental trajectory? Obviously this is a totally unfair question, but even just an additional research that you've done, or maybe like secondary research that you've done, have you seen any references to to this program either in later Nicaragua or Brazil, or in what ways is Chilean example drawing on the lessons of Cuba in the 1960s, as it also tried to expand its access to to food for the masses. But then the other question is, I guess I'll just hop on Christy's train and say, it's much more self-serving, I guess, which is, in the case of Venezuela under Chavez, there's a massive boom in consumption. And we don't talk about it now because it's, the context of scarcity and the rest of it. But, between 2004 and 2012, consumption soared in all sorts of ways, but primarily through oil wealth, right? And so therefore it was unsustainable over time. So I guess in the case of Chile in particular, how is this question of consumption at scale addressed, or how does it relate to the question of input, especially through the nationalization of copper? And is there a way in which that particular access to a commodity chain that is very lucrative, allowing for ways that ultimately might become sustainable, a process of consumerism that is a little bit more expansive? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for those questions, Alejandro. The regional aspects of this, I think, are important because there are parallels, certainly parallels happening in all these places. There's a book I haven't yet read on Nicaraguan food. forgetting the authors, Christina Barth teaches in Europe, and I think explores some of these similar themes under the Sandinistas in the late 70s and early 80s. Yeah, you can extend it further to the PT in Brazil. I mean, some stuff in Venezuela, the formation of the CLAP in Venezuela and the HOP, maybe some parallels there. It would have been way too much to chew off in this particular book, and so I tried to keep it Chile focused. And always the response or the critique of that is, what is unique here? We know these similar things are happening in these other places, and yeah, I don't know that it's necessarily exceptional. Except I would say the kind of political valence of it seems to be a little bit different than Argentina, Mexico, elsewhere, at least at that same time period. The places where there are regional connections, and some people are doing some work on this. I know I saw Sarah Kozame there talked about agrarian reform in Cuba. So the agrarian reformers, right? So they move around a lot and learn a great deal from one another. I think it's chapter 4 with this guy, Jorge Ahumada, who's a CEPAL economist who a fascinating trajectory before he comes back to Chile and starts thinking about agrarian reform. He is in the United States during the New Deal period. He studies at the US Department of Agriculture briefly, goes to Harvard. He studies with the kind of leading agricultural economists, as well as Joseph Schumpeter at Harvard, goes to Guatemala during the Arevalo years, is in Puerto Rico for a bit, and then eventually becomes a kind of leading thinker on agrarian reform for the Christian Democrats. And he dies very young before phrase agrarian reform actually begins, but he's one person who's been, at that point, been thinking about that for a long time and has these regional connections. Jacques Chonchol, another person, spends a fair amount of time in Cuba and reflects upon kind of the shortcomings of Cuba's agrarian reform, and then as one of the kind of gurus of agrarian reform under Frey and then also under Allende, tries to kind of, change the direction of Chile in response to some of those shortcomings he saw in other places. The nutrition scientists, also there are some connections in the 30s and 40s. A lot of it is mediated by international institutions. So the League of Nations first, also the International Labor Organization, become a kind of conduit through which knowledge about nutrition flows throughout Latin America. Yeah, there's some, I think Karin mentioned Chilean historian Juan Carlos Andrade Yanez, who's worked on some of these, especially the International Labor Organization and some of their missions throughout the region. So there is that regional network that Chile draws upon, and that's important. But I think it's obviously not the center of my book. I think that's a kind of a different project. The other question, the consumer boom relation to the export orientation and copper. This seems to also not be particularly unique, right? You mentioned Venezuela in the early Chavez years, Cuba similarly. I mean, Michelle Chase talks about this in the early years of the Cuban Revolution. There's this big boom, and a lot of that has to do with kind of basic economic principles, that you have all of these people with lots of money, and at a moment there were goods that money could buy, and then the kind of disequilibrium between this huge amount of demand and diminishing supply, and various reasons for that happen in each of those contexts. But yeah, I think Chile under Allende, they don't assess the importance of copper to maintaining sufficient supplies of foreign exchange. And when the copper prices tank in the second year of the UP government, the ability to import what food they needed to make up for the shortcomings before kind of the new agrarian reform production kicked into high gear becomes devastating, right? They don't have the new copper money to pay for food prices, which are also soaring. Global food prices are also soaring at that moment, and so it becomes this kind of combination of disastrous effects that are exacerbated by the United States and others are putting pressure on the government. But yeah, perhaps that's not unique, but I think it is important to remember that period of abundance, because the traditional story is that, it was all economic crisis throughout 3 years of the revolution. And there was this pretty amazing first year, even if it was unsustainable.
I did want to give Karin a chance to intervene again if you'd like to follow up.
Sure. I mean, this has been a very interesting discussion. And, I did have a question. This is like the totally unfair question, but following up on this, this discussion about sort of socialist development and all and socialist modernization, I wondered, I mean, one of the things you don't discuss at all in this book is sort of the ecological or environmental perspective. And I wonder if we were going to think about the, kind of socialist project of modernization, in particular agricultural modernization, or or the socialist relationship to natural resource extraction. Would that, how would that change your story, or would it change your story? Because if we looked at this, whole project from like a more energetic perspective, right? I mean, what does it mean for, beyond the questions of justice, which are obviously very important, but what does it mean to, consume more?
Yeah, so I think among the shortcomings, perhaps both of my book and the project of the UPE itself, is this lack of any sort of vision of ecology and environment, right? I wanted so much at some point to run across something that suggested that the Allende government, different socialist thinkers on the economy were thinking about the environment in any way beyond just sort of this thing that could be extracted from. You can continue to produce more and more for domestic consumers, and I've never found anything that suggested there was much consideration for, ecological concerns within the government. Obviously, Tom Glubach and others have written about, the pressure from indigenous groups, particularly in the South, and a sort of different ecological cosmology. But within the kind of leadership of the government, and particularly in urban groups, there's, I think, very little about that. I could be wrong, and I hope there is some things on that, but it seems limited. And that's ultimately the weakness, right? And some on the Christian left, the Catholic left, begin to critique Allende towards the end of the revolution on this point. They suggest there needs to be a sort of new ethical consideration of consumption. It's not just about getting people to consume as much as they can, about creating this affluent, abundant society, but it's about restricting consumption. That's a revolutionary principle that they believe Allende should have promoted, but that doesn't really ever happen.
I mean, it's interesting when you read. I wonder if you could. Because the impression I got from reading your book is that for policymakers in Chile, like land was never an issue. Like there always seemed to be an abundance of land. It was more about making the land produce properly, or extending or bringing more land into cultivation. But there's never this sense of like scarcity of land. At least I didn't get that from your book. And I wonder, so if you looked at a place like Cuba, maybe, right? Or if you looked at, the case of Mexico, where the population was perhaps less mobile than it was in Chile. I mean, would these questions around sort of uses of land and exploitation of land look different? Just sort of a...
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I think probably they would. I've always been kind of baffled. I agree with what you said. There's never a discussion. There's always enough land. The kind of refrain throughout the 20th century is Chile's land. I forget what the exact numbers are, but if it was adequately worked, and you break up these large, inefficient estates, there was plenty of land to feed, 15, 20, 30 million people. Chile has a fair amount of agricultural land, but it's not compared to a lot of places. There was always this sense, I think, urbanization and the growth of the population in the 1960s and 1970s, I think, increases much more significantly than a lot of the social scientists expected. I think that's probably happens around most of Latin America at that point. And the limits, understanding the limits of how much could actually be produced in some of these places, or how many improvements needed to be made, whether it was irrigation or, a lot of the land wasn't necessarily pristine arable land. It needed to be improved in some way to be able to produce. And that isn't always taken into much consideration.
So just to wrap up, Josh, I don't know if you have any final words for us.
I hope you've enjoyed the presentation, and thank you so much for all of you attending. It's great to see so many familiar faces, and
Good.
feel free to buy the book.
So we really want to congratulate Josh for the wonderful book, Karin for the excellent comments, taking us really into the Chilean history and also opening up some of the broader comparative conceptual questions, and the audience for your comments too, which I think are an example of how this book is likely to generate ongoing conversation across fields and across the region. So once again, muchas felicidades, Josh. Thank you all for joining us.
Congratulations.
And we'll be promoting your book.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much, Karin, for taking the time to comment as well. I really
Oh,
appreciate it.
congratulations.
Thank you, Sinclair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Take care.
Thank you
care,
all.